Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Modern Brewer podcast with me, your host, Chris Lunton. Well, it's great to be back. July was actually, honestly, such a great month. First, for those who attended or may have heard of it, there was the CIBD Sustainability Conference, naturally something that I was going to be in love with. It was the first of its kind. I've never seen a full conference on sustainability like this in the brewing industry. And actually, it was the first conference the CIBD has done in over 15 years. I obviously knew what to expect content-wise, sustainability, but I feel like a lot of these conferences live and die by their organization, their goals, the speakers, and the agenda of the speakers as well. But this was honestly one of the best conferences I've been to because it ticked all of those boxes. I think having such a dedicated focus was great because it kind of meant all the topics were instantly relevant and they mattered to everyone in the room. And there was a pretty high level of understanding of sustainability in the room. So quite a lot of the talks got to circumnavigate the why is this important, which often ends up being the first 10 minutes of every sustainability talk because we all knew that it was important. Also, I mean, the quality of speaker was literally out of this world. There was Professor Charlie Bamforth, Tom Brewer, for anyone who's had the privilege of listening to him speak. He's the global sustainability lead at AB InBev. Pretty big job. Mike Barry, I've never met before, but he's the director or former director of sustainability at M&S. There's been like white papers written on the stuff that he's done in sustainability. Kristen Hughes, she's the global head of sustainability at Diageo. Like the list goes on. There's Heineken, Molson Coors, so many of the biggest and greatest breweries. So it meant you got to mingle with these people as well, right? So not only do you get to listen to the speaker, you go up and ask them questions. And I just found like, when do you ever get this? Also, what's really special about the event is they had panels with all of these people, all of these heads of global sustainability in the largest, most competitive breweries in the industry, all on the panel, sharing their wins, goals, areas improvement, strategy. Like, when does this happen? When have you ever seen all of these people doing that? Yeah. And then on the final day, this idiot had to go up on stage after Tom Brewer just gave a ludicrously charismatic, engaging, and interesting presentation where he talks about the issues he faces in over 170 breweries that they're in charge of in terms of sustainability. And I was going in there talking about just the problems I had in just one, which was, of course, the Vault City project that I'd been working on. For reasons I can't really quite understand, I was writing my presentation a couple of weeks before. I was like, I kind of want to be controversial and I kind of want to do something quite different because I did feel that potentially the problem with a big sustainability conference is everyone's banging the same drum. And actually, do we always talk about the reality of some of the situations that people face, especially with sustainability, and that it's not just an environmental sustainability vanity project? This is, we're looking at the financial sustainability as well, which a lot of potentially the bigger brewers don't see in their sustainability plan because they're given budgets, they spend within the budget, they've got to allocate, but their goal is net zero. A craft brewery's goal is not net zero, it's having a sustainable business, it's here for the future. And often a craft brewery is one bad financial decision away from going under. So it's really important that we don't treat sustainability as a vanity project, which is why I wanted to do. So a long and short of this is basically I stood in front of the greatest minds of sustainability in brewing and told them that I advised Vault City to buy a secondhand gas-fired steam boiler, which is pretty controversial as a concept. I like to say I did back it up with other things, just optimizing your process is the best way. There's novel ideas of how to decarbonize, but, trying to invest in new heating technology right now, it just doesn't make sense to me. And I think, I was a bit nervous after it because I was like, God, what have I just done? But a few people said it was nice to hear something honest. So hopefully it's all the other people who just think I'm it now. A video of this is actually available. For those who attended, it's available right now. For those who didn't, a video of all of the talks in the main room will be available in December, I believe. So just keep your eyes peeled. I will definitely share a few clips on my socials, etc. And then, I'll share links in here in the future so you can have a look at that. I also, this is why July was so great, there was also the We Are Beer Industry Expo. I hosted the stage for the first time in my life, which was pretty exciting. And then I also got to speak with my very good friend and former podcast friend as well, George Wade. of shock horror, we talked about sustainability. This was a very different event, actually, and experience. There was not one talk on how to brew beer, which was different. It was all about branding, marketing, sales, financial economics of brewing. And I think that's a true testament to where our industry has gone over the last 3 or so years. No longer are we talking about the best lager recipe. It's now the best branding for your lager and how it's going to hit the right demographics and who is that demographics and what do they care about. I think the event was very brave to put on. It's the first of its kind that I can remember. I could be wrong, but I've never seen anything like this before. The speakers, again, were amazing, and the narrative was also really good. It was kind of formulated content rather than speak about what you want. So that meant there was actually quite a lot of themes and narratives and things you could pick up on, which was great. I also got to think about branding of my own businesses, which is pretty exciting. It was nice, never really get to think about that. So yeah, I think that they were both very different, but also very good events. I will say that actually over both events, I had a lot of people come up to me and say they listen to the show and they actually enjoy it, which is really nice to hear. This honestly does mean the world to me. So yeah, thanks to everyone who said that. Whilst we're on Brewing World Update, I got a couple more for you here. I'd just like to say, actually, the brewing trade, one of the companies I co-founded, has actually been kicking off for the last 2 months. This is why this podcast is slightly delayed. One of our sellers has actually even sold their entire Citra and Mosaic surplus, which is over 10 tons. The prices were insane. They were selling it at £23.10 per kilo for Citra. That's absolutely no joke for anyone who purchases hops. I know that's an insane deal. They're sadly gone now. That's all sold out. But we currently have Talus at £17.33 a kilo, which has just been flying since then. I've put a link to it in the show notes. As it is, that's how this website works once it's gone. So check it out, see what you think. And if you've got any questions, you can all fire them over to me. Finally, in the world of brewing, this is a really exciting update. My really good friend, my brother, Francesco Lo Bue, has been writing a weekly educational email on hops. I honestly, naively thought I knew hops pretty well. You would think I would after having a business in it and working in breweries, and I didn't. Like, the level of insight that he shares is something I am in awe of every single week. He's reading all the latest research and translating it into action that you can take in the brewery, sharing stories that I've sometimes been a part of, sometimes not, and his first-hand brewery floor experience. I just honestly think it's outstanding. So I just really want to give him a shout out. It's free. It lands 8 a.m. every Monday. And I think it's just a great way to start your week. I put a link in the show notes. Within that, there's actually also a free guide on how to read and understand your hop certificate of analysis. Again, most people get them. Do they fully understand them? And can you use them to get better hops and better beer at the end of the day? And that's what he's writing about. So yeah, check that out. It's in the show notes. Simple sign up. And then, yeah, you get that in your inbox every Monday. Okay, so now let's finally get into today's episode. I think I mentioned this before, definitely in my talks. Pretty sure I might have on the podcast as well, but I've been working in a brewery in Europe recently, and I saw firsthand just how expensive chillers can be to run. They're the forgotten child of most breweries, right? They just left to work tirelessly outside. You only speak to them when they stop working, and you kick off when they do, because everything goes to shit. Everyone's complaining, especially in the summer. But have you ever actually really got to understand it, understand how it works, how operationally you can reduce its cost? But then also, have you ever sized one up? And if you have you done it correctly? Because as soon as you size that thing up wrong, you are inflating your energy bills, your cash flow is going to be tough, and it's just basically going to hold you back from the sustainability targets. So in today's episode, we're going to unpack one of the most misunderstood and overlooked parts of any brewery, which is the refrigeration plant. And trust me, you do not want to learn these lessons the hard way after you've already invested in a chiller. Outside of that project in Europe, I'd actually been sizing a chiller for Vault City, and that's where I met today's guest, Jon. I realized just how easy it is to mess up a chiller sizing. The classic calculation that people use will literally, if you use that calculation, you will be costing your brewery thousands in wasted electricity. I actually guarantee it from the work that I've done now. there's also so many options out there. You can have a chiller with a return on investment, as it can actually have 100% heat recovery, which is just something that's really crazy. We're going to go into that into this episode. And I genuinely believe that they're going to play a really important role because of this. They're going to play an important role in brewing's future in the sustainability world. We're also going to go through how chillers work, and so you can understand their operational costs and what you can do. I've also learned there's a lot of charlatans out there in the refrigeration world. So with the information in this episode, I guarantee you'll be able to size a chiller correctly and keep an eye out for those bad suppliers offering oversized units. Today's guest is Jon Keyte, founder of Refcool, a refrigeration expert who not only broke it down all for me, but completely shifted how I think about cooling, heat recovery, and long-term operational planning. Jon is an expert in refrigeration. He writes a niche, which I always appreciate, but fantastic newsletter on refrigeration. And today he's going to help us avoid some expensive pitfalls and help us optimize the OpEx, or the operational expenditure of your chiller. So if you're buying a new chiller, this is an essential listen. But if you want to reduce your brewery's running costs, reduce its impact on the environment, and generally get to know more about this forgotten child, this will be a lot more fun than refrigeration might sound. So welcome to the show, Jon Keyte.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. Certainly.
Yes, very exciting, Jon. I mean, I said it just at the start. We met on the Vault City project, as I've met so many people on that, talking about chillers and refrigeration. And then I had firsthand experience recently of what happens when it all goes wrong. So I'm actually really glad we can do this episode together and we can go through everything, because I know you're such an expert in this area.
I like to think I know a few things about it, but yes, yeah. From experience, yeah.
So, Jon, not everyone is in niche into refrigeration like I am, and they might not follow your newsletter and follow you on LinkedIn. So for those people who don't, can you just give us a bit of background of who you are, how you started, and basically how did you land in this spot here today?
So I'm managing director of Refcool. Refcool is a small business. We manufacture some particularly energy efficient chillers for oncology machines. We manufacture pasteurizers and a few other small bespoke machines. We also have our own set of service engineers around the country. So we will make, sell people's chillers, install, maintain, and service. Yeah, it's been. I got into this business. I was an accountant previously. And then there was an opportunity to move into the business side and to look at selling chillers and speccing it and supporting. And so, so I did that 10 years ago. Still at it and still enjoying it, still learning lots. So it's obviously, if you're learning lots and you're able to help people, that's good. So here we are.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I guess for a lot of brewers, definitely myself when I was brewing as well, the refrigeration plant is just a little bit of a black hole of your knowledge. You often, as I said right at the start of this, it's the kind of forgotten child. It's as long as it's working and it's doing what you need it to do in the right time, generally you don't think about too much else. And so that's why I'm quite keen to have you here to sort of educate us all a little bit more about it. But first, I know that you write that newsletter because I read it, but when did you start that? And why did you start that? Because it's pretty niche, which I always respect.
We started it about 3.5 years ago. It's just a way of putting some information out there. Exactly as you say, it's actually one of the things refrigeration and accountancy have in common. They both go by the by, never noticed until there's a problem. So I find that similarity quite difficult on occasion, but So, and there's a lack of information from people about how refrigeration works, even from, you might not need to know how the black box works, but even to make the black box work as effectively as it should do. There's some easy things to do. And we've also ended up doing some things on the website around actually giving people support when chillers fail as to things you can do, which you're not, if you're not an F-gas engineer, which might sort things out.
Yes. Yeah, because it's complex. I mean, I guess there's a reason a lot of people don't know is because it is actually quite complex to understand all the intricacies of it. It took me quite a lot of time to get my head around the whole concept, which you obviously helped out so much with. And then also there's just so much opportunity now with heat recovery, reducing the OpEx of your machine and everything. That's why I think this episode is going to be pretty sweet for anyone who's listening. I'm pretty excited.
So it's also true to say that quite often the chiller fails. It may well fail for it's nothing to do with the chiller. The chiller is part of a larger process. because of its nature, is designed to protect itself. So if it feels it's a situation where it might damage itself, it will likely switch off rather than actually fundamentally break. And therefore, we find ourselves, when we attend breakdowns and things, often commenting on the other system that the chiller is supplying as opposed to the chiller. And so in that regard, chillers get a bad rep, and I feel like we need to put one forward.
This is it. This is the podcast of redemption for chillers. And this is the point where everyone turns off. So let's just go in, because I think this is good for everyone, just to refresh, or maybe just start, how do chillers or refrigeration plants actually work, especially in the brewing context?
I just wanted to start by saying most of the occasions where the chillers are working, they're working with a glycol water mixture. They're feeding cold around a circuit. And there might be two different types of chillers. Typically, a chiller might have its own internal tank. So it will cool that tank and then send that glycol water out. Or it might be what we call a flow cooler, where you don't bother with the tank and it just takes the glycol coolant straight in, cools it, and then takes it out. So basically, you can think of a chiller as a tank of cold water and a pump. And that's probably the best way to think about it from a layman's perspective. The only thing I would say is basically the chiller just removes heat. And it removes it through its circuit, and then it is typically blown into the air through a fan coil that blows that heat into the air.
Yeah, that's good. As you said, I think anyone who's worked with a chiller will always sit there and feel the heat coming off the side of it. And that's something that we will be talking about later, on how to potentially recapture some of that waste heat. Yeah, if you could just maybe just go into the refrigeration circuit itself. So
we just talked about the tank option. So if you had most chillers would have a tank in them, and the tank would have an evaporator in it, and the evaporator delivers the cooling into the tank, and the evaporator is part of what we call the refrigeration circuit. So what happens is that the refrigerant gas passes through the evaporator into the compressor, where it's compressed, and that transfers the heat up. So an example would be if you're pumping up a bicycle tire, you're compressing the air, and that generates heat, and that heat is exactly what the compressor generates and puts into the system. That then gets sent out through the condenser, which is typically like a car engine radiator with a fan behind it, and the fan then pushes air across the radiator, taking all that heat and emitting it. And then the refrigerant gas going through that circuit comes back into an expansion valve, where it then reverts back to a more normal state before going back into the evaporator again and continuing to cool the water in the tank.
Yes. Yeah. So what I'll do is, because a lot of people are visual learners in the brewing industry. So I will find, I don't know if you have one on your website. If you do, perfect. If not, I'll find one just so people can see how a refrigeration circuit works. Because once you just listen to what Jon said and you see it, it just makes perfect sense. You're like, I get it, how it all works.
Yeah, I can send you something through fairly easily. It tends to be just a straight square with your 4 sides to it. Okay.
Yeah, I think it really helps, just the understanding of how a cooling circuit works. So in this context of this, I think that the implications of undersizing a chiller are probably mainly in the process side. So that would be, for example, your crash cooling takes longer than you want it to, or if you're running it on the back of like a separator, you're cooling, you can't quite achieve the liquid at the flow rate. That's kind of what happens when you undersize, and that drives a lot of fear in the brewing industry. I feel that
it drives a lot of fear with everyone who uses chillers, basically. You don't need that approach.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly, because they're like, okay, well, the last thing I want is to run out of cooling capacity in my brewery, so I'll make sure that I add an extra 15-20% of cooling capacity just in case I need it. So that's quite common in the brewing industry. But what are the implications of oversizing a chiller?
So the implications of oversizing are that, particularly where you have your tank of water, is that the compressor of the chiller clicks on and off more regularly. As with most electrical items, like a compressor, it's the starting phase that is most inefficient and then uses most current. And so if you have it clicking on and off, not only does it wear the compressor hugely, I mean, typically you measure a compressor's life and the number of starts and stops. If you're starting and stopping 10 times an hour, then that's an awful lot of starts and stops, an awful lot of life in a short period of time. not only is it electrically inefficient, but you also have it run through that compressor's life in short order.
That's what it is. When you're oversizing, you're basically running it inefficiently because it needs to do more of the start stops, and it's the start that is the most energy intensive for the least reward, so to speak.
It draws all the current. This is not necessarily the brewing industry. We had a customer in the packaging industry who wondered why their chiller kept on breaking down regularly. Well, the answer was they went through the exercise to make sure they would never ever run out of cold, and they were running a chiller that was 8 times the size of the load they needed, even at peak. And so this thing was stopping and starting 15 times an hour. It would break down every 6 months or so just because it was stopping and starting that much. And then the electrical efficiency. We run the efficiency measure we often use is COP, which is the amount of cooling per kilowatt of electricity. And so we'd be looking at about 3 for a good chiller. And actually, this chiller was running at 1. So by just downsizing the chiller by a quarter to a quarter of its original size, we not only save them huge electrical cost, but also enhance the life of the chiller. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, and that's was very similar to what I saw at the brewery I was working at. It was the compressor starts were, I think it was 60 in a 12-hour period, right. And it was closer to sort of 1.1 than it should have been. It should have been around 2 as a COP. So it was using almost twice the electricity it should be using, which is a lot, because it's around, in a brewery, it's around 40% of the whole of the electricity demand. It's just coming from that refrigeration plant. And if that's double,
it makes a huge difference. Yeah.
Makes a huge difference. What sort of compressor starts are normal in a day or in a 12-hour period, whatever is better?
2 or 3 an hour, perhaps. That's It's all dependent on how you size the machine, basically. What also happens, I probably forgot to mention, is that some of the manufacturers actually prevent their compressors from coming on and off too regularly in an hour. So there will be a mandatory stop time. So you'll only be allowed 4 starts an hour or 3 starts an hour, that sort of idea, which means that then plays into your brewers' worst nightmares of them not getting cooling, and they wonder why, and they think the chiller's broken, when in fact the compressor's just saying, no, I'm not going to start and stop 12 times an hour. I'm only going to do it 4 times an hour. You're going to have to wait.
Yeah, so that's the key issue with oversizing, right?
Absolutely.
So it's just, means that it's running inefficiently, then it's going to break down more often, and the wear is greater. So is it right to say
you might not even get to that stage if you have a big machine where the compressor is limited in its starts, which can be quite often? Then you will have the machine stopping, and you'll wonder why.
Yes,
that won't help your brewing process.
Are they are chillers the type of machine that like to be running all the time, or
they're more efficient the longer they run, basically? Pretty much so, yeah. And it depends what type of compressors you're talking about, but the modern scroll compressors and the big screw compressors, they do definitely like to be run. And the screw compressor in particular would be ramped up or ramped down rather than being switched off. Switching off, and it takes a lot out of them.
Yes, so that's actually leading me on to a really good point, because this is what I learned a lot from you, Jon, is the types of compressors and how they impact the correct sizing of a chiller. So talking about scroll compressors, inverters, different steps, maybe we can go into that to give the listener sort of an understanding of, if you can't run it 100%, which we realistically won't be able to do all the time, what then impacts how you can correctly
just
size
before going to that, it is worth just making a comment about ambient temperature. And so that ambient temperature has a big effect on the power the chiller can put out. And so frequently we size against a maximum summer temperature, which we're currently doing is 35 degrees. And everyone will say, wow, 35 degrees isn't enough, because yesterday it was 37. But maximum at some point. The power available at 37 is less than the power available at 25. So this is why that maybe you can have an oversized chiller at 25 degrees, which is correctly sized at an ambient of 35 degrees. And any brewery is not going to change its chillers around depending on what the ambient temperature is.
Yeah, so what would you recommend to be a correct ambient temperature for, well, we're in the UK, so let's just UK.
So we do the 35, but just bear in mind that's a maximum. That's not that will not be a regular week in, week out. It won't be operating at 35-degree ambient. Well, depending on how you position it. If you position it without a decent airflow, it might be a continuous 35, but in most cases, it will vary up and down. So you get more capacity out of it at the lower ambient temperature. So coming back to what you were saying about compressors, so when you're sizing, it's one of the elements I would look at with sizing is you try and size it to make sure it can achieve the required load in a 35-degree ambient. But then we try and do an exercise where we look at part load and make sure it can run efficiently at part load. Because if it's the same load at 25-degree ambient, you probably find you only need 70% of the power. And this is where we were talking, I think with the number of the projects. If you have a single compressor and it only switches on and off, and you're trying to get it to run at 70% power, as with some of the smaller units, all it will do is switch on and off. It'll give you 100%, then it has enough, and it'll switch off, and then it'll switch on again when it's required. And so we try and make sure we have either multiple compressors, multiple scroll compressors, to give you what we call capacity steps. So if you have a 4-compressor chiller, it will probably have 25% capacity steps as it brings on each of those compressors. Without an inverter, the compressors can only run at full pace or none. And so the only efficient way to do it is to run at 25% power, 50% power, 75% power, or 100% power. That works very effectively. And it's one of those key things you need to look at when you're sizing a chiller.
Yes. Yeah, because I think we all just look at the output. Okay, it's a 100 kilowatt chiller in terms of cooling capacity. And then that's kind of what you size, what often you would size it to, is actually what does it generally run at? Because if that's on average running at 25, 30 kilowatts and then only spiking to 100, then you're actually running it really inefficiently for a long time if you've got just a classic one scroll compressor.
Absolutely. And there are some people who would run buffer tanks to try and ameliorate that. So we would run a large cold water tank that they cool down, and then that draws off, and it makes sure the compressor only comes on or less often than it would do if it was once. It's one of the reasons why you have water tanks in chillers. Otherwise, you do find the compressor coming on and off quite regularly.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because a lot of the breweries I go and see, there seems to be a very different setup. So they either have, as you said, like most chillers I see in the brewing world have a small glycol reservoir inbuilt in the chiller or next to the chiller. It's pretty tiny. But then some breweries I go into have like 10, 15, 20 hec glycol tanks full of glycol, glycol water mix, and that's going around. Like why are they so different? And is there one that's maybe better or worse, do you think?
Well, maybe that's a kind of exaggerated example from a small 100-litre tank to a big hectolitre reservoir. But the reason for it is to try and make sure the chiller is working efficiently when it works. So what will happen is the big glycol tank will warm up as it's being used. And when it hits a certain temperature, the chiller will then turn on to cool that glycol tank. And we'll be running for maybe an hour or a couple of hours, or maybe even 3 hours to cool that glycol tank. And because it's running for that length of time at full speed, it's much more efficient than trying to get it to switch on and off every 15 minutes to accommodate a smaller reservoir. So in this occasion, those large reservoirs are a good idea from that respect. The only issue is they need to be insulated so they don't warm up and you lose about the heat.
Yeah. Otherwise, then you're just paying to keep it cool.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we're going to.
We had a particular case study of a brewery down in Sussex, actually, who did extremely well with a buffer tank. Managed to run with a smaller chiller than they needed for maximum load, because the buffer tank then took that weight out of the system for the 3 or 4 hours that they were brewing. And it was quite interesting. They spent a long time sizing the chillers absolutely perfectly.
Yeah.
So on a Preppers Day, it was absolutely running flat out for almost 24 hours to restock the reservoir as well as to maintain the load.
Yeah, that's what I learned as well. It takes to size a chiller correctly takes quite a lot of data and understanding of your process and your refrigeration needs. I think as I've said to you, and I said right at the top of the show, the classic way of sizing a chiller, and there's plenty of refrigeration websites that have this as their tool. You put in your fermenters, the volume, how quickly your delta T, so what temperature they start, what temperature you want to finish, and the time you want to do it, and it'll regurgitate a kilowatts required to either do all of that or just like part of it. I don't know whether it's like 4 or 5 tanks, and that is how a lot of chillers are sized.
So they normally put some contingency on that as well. You don't want to make...
Yeah, they'll normally put some contingency on that. Exactly. That's that 20% just in case. But actually, the reality of you chilling every single tank from 20 to 2 all at the same time, it doesn't exist in the real world. And therefore, that instantly leads you to oversizing your chiller, because now you've assumed that you will do it and you'll chill everything at the same time. So what I did with Vault City is I did some pre-work before I came to other refrigeration experts. I did my pre-work. So I mapped out what a busy day in the brewery looks like, what is happening during that day in terms of fermentation schedule, which is actually pretty negligible, how many tanks are going to be cooled, if they're all going to be cooled at the same time, because if they're not, that staggers that load over the course of 2 days. And then if you're chilling at the back of the centrifuge, chilling for an inline carbonator, etc. So all of this stuff is like going into the model, and then you can work it out. And to give you an example of just how different it was, what one company right at the very start, before I got involved in it, had quoted a 600 kilowatt chiller for this project, and I calculated that we needed no more at any one time, no more than 140.
Wow.
So as soon as you start seeing that, that's where, if you were to go with the chillers based on that, if you get a 550 watt chiller or 600 kilowatt chiller for something that only needs to be ran at, sort of 30, 40, 50 during the most day and peaking up to like 150, it's like that is where your inefficiency really, that's where everything you said about
the chillers to be breaking down fairly regularly because they're just not doing the load, they're not being allowed to run.
Exactly.
So I'm very impressed with that, because we always shy away from that, because those numbers and those calculations are normally so horrendous, and getting the right numbers from the brewers is very difficult. So what we normally suggest is just to put our monitoring equipment on and work out what typically gets used in a week or a couple of weeks. And we find that's always a revelation.
John, that is absolutely the best way of doing it. Yeah. Because just go through that process, because I don't think everyone will be aware, but if you just go through how that works, because that is like the easiest way. If you're not growing massively or moving into a new brewery and you're just kind of replicate what you have now, but more efficiently, that's definitely 100% the best way of doing it.
Well, I was going to say, you got my huge respect for doing your models, because I would not even know where to start with it. But what we do is we monitor the cold water usage, or the chilled water usage. So we have a machine that we would leave on site monitoring usage over typically a couple of week period. So we can see how the brewery typically works during those couple of weeks. And that monitors flow, temperatures, electrical usage, and enables us to then put together a good chart to see the peaks and troughs of usage, but also how the existing chiller is performing, what the part load is. So there's one particular brewery we did down in Sussex, which showed that most of the time it was working exactly as you said, about 30%. And then it had the one day, which was the brewing day, when they would hit in and do 100% pretty much all day. And then it would go back to 30% again. It's very good getting them a chiller with a single compressor that just does 100% load. Yeah, so they've ended up with a double, I think they've ended up with a double compressor chiller. So at least they can tone down to 50% load during the rest of the week.
Yeah. And that's what a great chiller spec process looks like, is when you can, take, I think there's two ways of looking at it, because there's two types, right? As you said, like where some breweries are building a new brewery with big growth potential in this sense. So you have to model what it's going to look like in the future. But if you're replicating, it's like kind of a bulletproof way of doing it. You can work out so much, and a few weeks later, and you don't have to do all this silly modeling that
and it's weird.
I had to, although it would be fun to do the model and then do that and then compare the two to see how accurate your model was.
Well, you'll find out, and then if it's accurate with the Vault in due course.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I've got another question for you, John, as well, because I see this again differently approached in different breweries. is running multiple chillers more or less efficient than just running one?
So we talked about a chiller being a couple of compressors or multiple compressors in a chiller. Running multiple chillers is only an extension of that to an extent. And
Love that.
if you're running smaller chillers, they may well only have one compressor in each. So running 2 chillers each with one compressor is pretty much the same as running one chiller with 2 compressors in it. It's just you double up on the pumps and the tanks potentially on how it's designed. When you have multiple chillers, typically you might have a buffer vessel, which all the chillers work upon. So that, otherwise, you get into more lag and lead type territory. With a buffer vessel, what it means is that both chillers work on chilling that main vessel, like your big hectoliter store of glycol. And depending on what temperature that reaches, the chillers will kick in to correct it back down to the temperature it needs to be. An alternative would be to set up the 2 chillers at different set points without the buffer tank. And so therefore, when the cooling works, the one chiller works quite merrily, and if the one chiller can't cope, then the temperature gets too high and the second chiller kicks in, basically. That would be a way of doing it. If that makes sense.
And that's the key part of running the 2 chillers, right? That they're not working at the same time unless they need to. So you want one running as like 100%, and then when it can't keep up, you have that other one kicking in, right?
And you try and swap them over as well to make sure there's equal usage. But yes, absolutely, as you say. Because otherwise, if you have them running both at the same time, they're both running at essentially 50% capacity and chop out very quickly. Again, being electrically inefficient, all the things we were talking about, putting undue wear on the compressors in the system.
Yeah. So how would a brewery now, what's their best way of assessing the OpEx or the cost of running their chiller? If they're listening to this going, oh, I think we might be running it inefficiently, how can they check that out?
One of the indicators would be just to see the number of hours the chiller is actually running. Stops you do in an hour. Again, I guess that's difficult to do unless you actually sit there and watch it, which, there are more exciting things in life, I understand. But you can get some monitoring equipment to do it, required to monitor the electrical supply and see how it comes on and off. But that would give you a prime indicator. If it's coming on and off more than probably 6 times an hour, you're getting more to the inefficient end.
Yeah, and those energy meters would be a good way as well, right? They could, as you said, you could attach that same energy meter you would use to see where your chiller is using at the moment. You could use exactly the same thing to see how much energy it's using.
Yeah, an electrical monitor might be more interesting in that you'd see there when the compressors clicked on and clicked off over time. That's what you're really looking for. An energy meter should show it, but just a straight voltmeter that your standard electrician tablet would give you that information.
Yeah, it's a good way, and then you can then back calculate how much cooling you've used over that week, and then you can work out the COP.
Yeah,
that's that takes a little bit more work, but it's not too bad actually. Fairly basic. So you just need the formula.
So you get the output COP. You need the temperatures, but the one was, and the temperatures are fairly easy. You can buy little thermostats off the internet for 30 quid. And allow you to Bluetooth monitor your phone, and they'll do you a nice graph over 24-hour period quite happily. The tricky bit is always the flow rate and understanding what the flow rate is. A good flow meter is a very expensive item, costs you 1,500 quid, £2,000, and even then might not be as effective as you want it to be. So that's tricky. But yes, your chiller, when it arrives, will normally have a fixed speed pump. So you can just backtrack it from the pressure gauge on the pump. The back pressure on the pump would then lead you to believe that what the flow rate is. And that's a way we use quite often.
Great. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think measuring the OpEx is always a really useful thing to do. And there's just so much room in most breweries, not all, but in most breweries, there's definitely room for improvement on running the chiller more optimally, or chillers if you have multiple. And then if you're sizing as well, it's a really good way of probably calculating a return on investment as well, if you can see that yours is running inefficiently because it's oversized, and you can get maybe a smaller one, or a newer one with a multi-step compressors or an inverter, and then you can see how much you can save. So
there's the equation for how you calculate chilling power. I don't know whether you do that sort of stuff.
Let's
So
definitely. That's the sort of stuff we love. Yeah. Let's do it.
Basically, as a rule of thumb, it's 4 times the temperature difference times the flow rate in liters per second.
Okay. And that determines what,
That determines your output cooling power.
Output cooling power. Okay. Can you repeat that one
So
more
it's
time?
4 times the temperature difference going into and out of the chiller. So if the temperature of the coolant coming into the chiller might be, say, 3 degrees, and the temperature going out might be -2. So typically the difference might be 5 as an optimal, times 4 times the flow rate, actually in kilograms per second. But given that water is roughly 1, we can make that roughly liters per second. And that then gives you your power. So if you want a COP, you then take that cooling power and divide it by the electrical input power. That gives you a COP.
There we go.
There are all sorts of metrics that you can compare it to as to whether you're being efficient or not.
Yeah. What does it's all depending on the refrigeration plan, the refrigerant gas, etc. But where would you typically expect to see, as you said, 1 absolutely bad? That's 1 to 1. Obviously, that's really bad. But what would you expect to be good, and what sort of best in class? At the
best in class, you'd probably be just north of 3, but anywhere 2.5 to 3 is pretty good. It'd be nicer to be 3 or thereabouts.
Yeah. So it actually leads me quite nicely on to CapEx versus OpEx. So everything we've talked about here makes perfect sense, right? You want to run it efficiently at the loading that you have. You want to have spec it out so when you peak, you get what you want. However, having a multi-step compressor, having a inverter, I'm going to assume has a CapEx implication to it as well. Like how much more are we talking? Is it really putting things out? Is it doubling budgets, or how does that look in terms of CapEx?
Let's just come back a little bit and talk about a couple of other things as well before I tackle that. On the CapEx side, we also have this issue about refrigerant gases. So there's a lot of change going on in the refrigeration industry as the world tries to get rid of ozone layers and get rid of the old style refrigerant gases, move more towards low GWP gases. And we've had refrigeration equipment for many years in the UK and around the world. And because of that, the costs of the existing refrigerant equipment or equipment using existing refrigerants has been driven down pretty low. It is very cost effective. So when you're talking about CapEx, probably the cheapest chillers you'll find are running R410A. And they are efficient and they are a comparatively cheap capital cost. But we're all committed to do away with R410A by 2030, and it'll only be available. Second, it's only second-hand R410A that's available since, I think it's 2020. So gradually, the plan is to throttle the markets. There's no more R410A available, and thus get everyone to change onto something else. But basically, what I was trying to say is CapEx is cheap for old-style chillers with old-style refrigerants because we've made lots of them. We know them. There are lots of parts around. You then have all the new style refrigerants coming out where people have had to put R&D in to develop new compressors, new components, which haven't been mass produced in quite the same way. So there is an increasing cost going for a new low GWP chiller. And then a further layer on that is that you have 2 distinct groups. You have the low GWP chillers, which is things like R454B, R513A, which are about the 500 GWP mark, which are getting a big improvement over current, but not quite the end game. And they are more cost effective from a CapEx perspective. They also tend to be more efficient. They're more akin to the existing R410A. So they would be slightly more preferred. And then the end goal has got to be a natural refrigerant, which is currently propane is the favorite for everyone at the moment, which is great, but it requires special components. Chillers are considerably more expensive, at least probably 20 or 30% more expensive. The GWP of them is 3, so they have very little effect on the ozone layer. They do tend to be quite efficient, particularly at the sort of temperatures that a brewer would be operating at. They're not quite so efficient at the 12.7, which is the standard we look at, but at the kind of +3, -2, they're a really good alternative as a refrigerant. So that partially answers the question about CapEx versus OpEx. I suppose the point about the OpEx on those is that R410A1, it is currently not too expensive because of legislation will get much more expensive. So in the event you have leaks, it will be more expensive to repair and more difficult to repair. The low GWP should be around for a good few years yet, at least 10 to 15 years, if not 20. And so you shouldn't have a problem getting that, and the price of that will stay comparatively low. Propane is used for lots of things.
Yes, and then when you're talking about inverters and multi-step compressors as well, presumably they add a cost, but at the you're basically building in flexibility to the OpEx, or into the running of it, so it can run more efficient at lower, mid, and high. But at the same time, that's going to increase the CapEx, no doubt.
Yes, so the inverters are quite expensive. There's a general distrust in the industry about inverters, partly because they haven't been around enough for us to really understand how they're going to last in the long run. I mean, inverters are very effective, what they do, but they are expensive. They need to be specially programmed. I guess our view tends to be it's another thing to go wrong.
Yeah.
But, so we would prefer, as a matter of style, to go with multiple compressors and have capacity steps. So running the compressors at 100%, as opposed to having an inverter. Or if you need more flexibility, to use a buffer tank to achieve the same goal. So certainly having a multi-compressor chiller as opposed to an inverter-driven chiller would be cheaper, considerably cheaper. I guess the other thing to bear in mind is that there's actually a pump running in each of these chillers pushing that glycol around. So if you wanted to use something that's an inverter drive, maybe that's a better thing to apply the inverter drive to save some.
Yeah, definitely. Those pumps can really rack up a lot of energy as
well. And they're all running 24/7. So
yeah, if you've got a 7 kilowatt pump running 24/7, you can do the maths on that. It's pretty expensive to run pretty quickly. Yeah, it's always it's a really good point, actually, inverter on those pumps, or even just some logic within the system so that it knows when there isn't demand for glycol that it doesn't need to run. And when there is a demand for glycol, it can switch on. There's systems like FrigiCloud that can manage that. Some really good stuff. Just smarter uses of electricity rather than just having things on 24/7 just for when you need them.
So we do use variable speed drives in the fans, typically on the chillers, which varies the airflow and helps manage capacity a little bit in that regard. And again, but that technology is much more mature. We know how they work. They go on for years and years. So, yeah. But again, it's a premium cost to get a variable speed fan, but increasingly becoming the way they're becoming standard.
Yeah. It's just a classic case of investing investing more CapEx now to reduce the OpEx later.
Yeah. And with electricity prices the way they are in the UK, it doesn't take much to get a payback, particularly if you're running them 24/7.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big point, actually. The cost of electricity has driven the OpEx into a big problem into a lot of breweries, especially, as I said, most breweries, craft breweries, it's about 40%, sometimes greater, of their total electricity usage. It's
particularly if you've oversized the chiller to start with. So we're discussing about how you site walls.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting there with a chiller that's probably 200 or 300% of what it needs to be, the electricity usage will be based on that 200 or 300% more than it needs to be.
Yeah, and it's a lot.
Payback is pretty quick. In some cases, we've seen payback on new chillers of less than a year.
Yeah, terrifying. I think this is a great time to start talking about heat recovery as well, John, and the ludicrous potential of the heat recovery of a refrigeration plant. So potentially you can just talk to us about what is heat recovery, how does it look in a refrigeration plant, and kind of how it works.
So if you go back to thinking about the chiller and the condenser and the evaporator, so you're just moving cold heat out of a cold tank that you're making colder and shoveling it out through the condenser and fan blown air out into ambient air. It's obvious when you think about it that perhaps we should try and do something with that heat. If you're talking about a heat pump, what a heat pump is doing is just using that air there. So we have CTA chillers that we stock here, which will actually do simultaneous heating and cooling. So literally, you suck the heat out of something cooling wine vat, and then put it into a wine vat that's cooking red wine. So it's very efficient. You're just moving the heat from one place to another. It makes a lot of sense. So when you're talking about heat recovery, all it's trying to do is do the same thing. You just put a little heat exchanger between the compressor and the condenser and just try to get rid of some of that heat preemptively. And there are two different types of heat recovery typically. One is what they call high temperature heat recovery, which is just basically a dumb heat exchanger that sits on that circuit, and you would pass water through it and it would heat that water up. And it will typically recover about 35 to 40% of the cooling power of the chiller. You can then move it on a stage and put in some controls, put some more detailed mechanism around it to make sure it's always optimized, and you can get up to 100% heat recovery out. So what that means is the chiller, rather than just dumping the heat out through the condenser radiator and the fan, is actually reusing all that heat for some other purpose. Typically, the heat is recovered in the way of warmer water for some other process. There is a brewery we deal with who have an issue because they're off-grid. So heating water for keg washing and the likes is quite difficult. So they will use heat recovery to heat a large tank of water. Okay, it never gets up to total temperature required to wash the kegs out, but it gets the water up to 50, 60 degrees, reduces the amount of oil they have to burn to then heat up the final bit to wash out the kegs. And they love it. I think you refer to it as a return on investment for a chiller. Who knows, you could have such a thing. But then you get into bigger challenges like we had with the Vault, which is when you're talking about reasonably sizable chillers, recovering heat from that chiller, what do you actually do with it?
Yeah, it's a big thing, because I think I'm gonna have to give context to this. So it's around like a 125 kilowatt chiller, and it's capable of what, 100% heat recovery, right, John?
Yeah.
So that's effectively, to put that into like real terms for a brewer, it was 200 hectoliters of water at around 50 degrees every 14 hours. That is a lot of water. On a chiller that's not that big. Like most breweries of that, most breweries around that size will be having a similar size chiller. Some breweries I know 200, 300 kilowatts. Some 500.
The heat recovered is not just the heat recovered from the cold process, but also the heat recovered from this input from electric. So 125 kilowatt chiller, you could potentially be recovering up to 165 kilowatts of heat, because it's 125 kilowatts from the cooling plus the 40 odd kilowatts that you put in as electric.
Yeah, it's actually almost too much for brewing, to be honest. But I think you've mentioned it before. There's other options. There's people have run it like underfloor heating, then they've run it for various water processes. Looking at the future as well, there is, like, as you said, this is perfect for heat pumps as well. This is exactly the sort of like waste heat that's used to heat up water, to where a heat pump can start to turn that into steam in the future. So the working out the ROI on that is return on investment for that is all about it eating into your gas usage if you're using gas, or whatever the energy you're using to heat hot water usually. Obviously, that's financially a lot less than an electricity. Unless you're heating with electricity, then it's going to be an absolute no-brainer. And oil, etc., is also very expensive. But that's how you calculate that ROI. Is just that's the amount of kilowatts you no longer have to heat with gas or electricity or oil. And then you can also work out the carbon savings on that as well, because now you're no longer burning that gas, you're no longer burning that oil, and that's where a lot of the environmental savings come. And this is really where craft breweries should be looking to decarbonize their scope 1 emissions. Like, new heating technology just isn't quite there yet, but these are the things that really help reduce that scope 1 emissions. But I just want to get this like point across as well. Heat recovery is not the thing that you can add in after you've brought the chiller, right? It has to be put in as a part of the original scope.
Yes, there is a potential to add in the part heat recovery that I was talking about, which is just a dumb heat exchanger, but it requires cutting into the refrigerant lines. It's not something that's easy or straightforward, but yes, you could, but the full heat recovery has to be done at the time that it was designed and put together again. Yeah. You need to make the decision up front. And I guess when you're saying that the technology is all there to do this currently, that's right. But you need to bear in mind that the heat pump is taking temperatures up And if you start at 50 degrees, it will find it much more easy to achieve the 90 degree than if you start at your 15 degree ambient or whatever tap water is when it comes into the building. So people say heat pumps can't do it. Well, the trick is if you've heat recovered into a tank, for instance, that's at 50 degrees, then it's easier to get that up to 90 degrees than waiting for a heat pump to try and get it from 12 degrees up to 90 degrees.
Yeah, and also just talking about COP, which is how they work as well. You'll never see a COP that's worthwhile if unless it's 3.5, 4, and you just won't get that from tap water to anything really with a heat pump. So it always needs, at the moment, it always needs that use of waste heat around the process to heat up temperature that at least it can work with.
Yep.
So, I mean, I guess we talked about the mistakes to avoid being oversizing your chiller. Also, another good one I've taken away is how to make sure that your chiller can manage different loads, because it's unlikely that you're going to be running it at 100%. You might be able to, but if so, you have to make sure that's designed in the system as well, right?
Yeah, and it's why you have to make sure that the chiller, when it's designed, will manage different loads, because it's not going to be the same. Even temperature variance will cause quite a big difference in the load on the chiller. And I understand that no one wants to be there in the middle of July trying to get their chiller to chill in a 37 degree ambient. So you need to make sure you cover off that, as well as the more general ambient conditions, which, if you're in Scotland, your average conditions are about 12, 13 degrees ambient, which is very different.
Yeah. How would you recommend that people assess when they need to upgrade or change their refrigeration system?
So you'd probably be looking to every 5 or 6 years, but at the current time, there's quite a push to look at it again because of the extreme cost of electricity and the poor sizing and design of current systems. A combination of those two can quite often lead to quite a substantial energy saving. And to do some of the things we were talking about, like perhaps just monitoring and seeing how often your chiller is running, what sort of output you're getting and how it compares with the design output. All good things to look at to understand its efficiency. And normally at least 5 years you'd run quite rarely on a set of chillers. But I would say now is a good time to look at it again because of the changes in refrigerant, in electricity costs and efficiency. It's particularly a good time to look at it again.
Yeah, absolutely. What questions do you think every brewer should ask their refrigeration supplier?
So what's operation like at part load would be a good one to start with. So everyone focuses on full load, but let's look at part load as well. How efficient is it at 50%, which is where you're likely to be running most of the year. That's quite a key element. And then the other one would be about what's the resilience? If this fails, what's the plan? Or if a component of this fails, what's the plan? Quite a number of chillers will have 2 circuits in them, particularly of a reasonable size, so one circuit can fail and the other circuit will work. So that gives you resilience immediately. So if one circuit goes down, you're not pulling your hair out. If you have a smaller chiller that's just a single circuit and it goes down, then what's the plan? So yes, we can always get a rental chiller to you within 24 hours typically, but that's an expensive option. Much better to build in some resilience to start with. Much, much better.
Yeah, great. So Jon, so let's talk about this newsletter quickly, because there might be some people listening to this who think this is genuinely really interesting and I'd like to learn more, but in a more bite-sized way, keeping on top of things. Maybe they're looking at replacing their chiller and they just want to stay informed. How do they get hold of your newsletter? What kind of topics do you cover?
We just try and keep topical about the things that you would want to know about if you were a buyer of refrigeration equipment. Changes in industry, developments in the industry, practical tips as to how to make your chillers work effectively, the importance of having a good service and maintenance regime, things you can do when your chiller breaks down, which you don't need to call a refrigeration engineer for. I don't know why we're telling people that, but
that's why I like you, Jon.
It makes everyone happy. There are things you can do to help before you call a refrigeration engineer and save yourself the big bill. We don't actually like to be up on site and say, the reason is you've got a block filter here. Done this yourself. Here's the bill. It's much better if everyone does it. Understands what's going on.
Great. So how can
So
people subscribe or listen? Or
www.refcool.co.uk or through our LinkedIn page.
Perfect. I'll link both in the show notes. There's a lot going on in those show notes this week. Lots of newsletters, lots of educational emails and other things on there. So hopefully additional free information coming out there, which I think is always really interesting to know. And it's quite nice when things are just sent to you and you don't have to actively go and look, and you can read it when you're commuting or just when you're just like relaxing a little bit and just have a little read of it. So I think there's always quite digestible, that style of content for me.
Yeah, we're also looking quite a lot at resilience at the moment. That's our big focus. So we have a resilience audit, which if anyone's interested in, you have a copy of the resilience audit. It's 30 questions, so you should just be asking yourself to make sure that your chiller's still going to be around. To try and counter this fact that the chiller just sits there in the back of the factory and works, and then one day it doesn't work, and then everyone's in a panic because they don't remember what it's for.
You just described 95% of brewers, including myself, for many years. I was just like, oh, it's working. I don't need to get. And then all of a sudden, it stopped working. Panic.
So the biggest cost is always the lost production.
Yes. Yeah.
Always
especially during fermentation, it's just a nightmare. Really hard to counteract a bad fermentation, to be honest. So yeah, if you get those fermentations rising to like 28, 30, and your beer's done, you lost that beer. Which is always, that's why I would be hammering your phone, John, if it was. I'm the exact sort of client you would have really disliked. Didn't say a word, and then when it goes wrong, call up and be like, John, I need you here in the next hour. Which I'm sure most people are like. It's must be part and parcel of the job, which is why you're giving out these tools.
But the other aspect on that is we have had, like lots of other industries, real problems over the last few years with general supply chain and spares. And there's nothing worse than when you go into a site and say, this is broken, and then you go and try and source that part and you find it's on a 6-month lead time. That's I can say things have improved somewhat over the last year and a bit, but there's no doubt the supply chain is not back to the way it was pre-COVID. It's a lot better, but it's not back.
Yeah, getting on top of it now. Preventative maintenance, these are the key.
Maybe even holding some spares on site of things that might be about to fail.
Yeah, great. So, John, this is mainly for my socials, but what are the top 3 things that you wish every brewer understood about refrigeration?
I wish they understood that it was about circulation of water, not necessarily all this fancy stuff. I had a reasonably good understanding that we're circulating water and glycol. So there are lots of other things that can go wrong as well as the refrigeration system. That we should be, when we spec it, it should be spec'd against a normal pattern as opposed to maximum pattern all the time. And it's the resilience thing. Make sure you think about it beforehand as to what you're going to do when it fails. Because when it fails, there's precious little time to do anything with it.
Yep. John, is there anything else you'd like to add before we close this episode off?
No, I think that's all. I hope that's been worthwhile. I hope there's some value to be had from that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, definitely, as I said, for me personally, when I was going through a lot of this, trying to do the things the right way, you helped me out immensely. And I'm also helped write some guides for CIBD sustainability. And I know you helped proofread my one on refrigeration. So they'll be coming out to CIBD members shortly. I'm thinking the next couple of months. So I'll plug those later on when they come out. But yeah, so thanks a lot for that. I really do trust your opinion on everything. And for all the tools and the work, the newsletters you do for people, I think that's why I can safely trust you as a good refrigeration expert and not some of the charlatans that I've had to deal with over the years. So I really appreciate that. So
thank you. Okay.
Yeah. And thanks a lot for coming on the show, John. Genuinely really appreciate it.
Okay.
So
thanks a lot. Okay. Cheers.
Well, that wraps up today's episode on refrigeration. A big thanks to John. As I said, one of the good guys in the industry. So I respect his opinion on everything refrigeration. If you liked today's episode or you liked any of the episodes of the Modern Brewer podcast, please do share with your friends, colleagues, anyone who you think might find it interesting. Any engagement on the social media post is greatly appreciated, as well as hitting that subscribe or follow button, wherever you get your podcasts from. And that's everything for this episode. I hope you have a great time, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Modern Brewer podcast.